Welcome to the Leftist Book Club installment number 3. That's right, where we are reading, or we have read, this book by Erik, Olin, Wright, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. That's this century, if you weren't aware. This book is by Erik, Olin, Wright. Really quick, a little background on him. He was radicalized in the 1960s, started writing books in the 1970s, all the way up until his death. He was an analytical Marxist sociologist from UW-Madison, which is not that far away from me and some of the chatters, which is pretty cool. He published this book in 2019. It was actually post-mortem. He passed away from cancer, I think, before the book was published. As he was writing it, he figured out he had terminal cancer. He wasn't able to get the prolonging help that he needed and unfortunately passed, but he writes a foreword in this book about how it originally had this other sort of vision for what this book needed to be, but his cancer caused him to change it. And he talks about how he really enjoyed the way that it came out, because he tried to appeal to a broader anti-capitalist audience, which is why the title says anti-capitalist and not using the word socialism or democratic socialism in the title, as a way to not use the buzzword of socialism. So if you are anti-capitalist but perhaps have hang-ups about socialism specifically, please stick around and at least listen to what he had to say, because he wrote this book. It is such a dense book. This book is so dense. There were times where I would read like 3 sentences and just have to stop and think about how much information was just portrayed in 3 sentences. I don't know if I would recommend the book if you're interested in this stuff, and like, it was a good read. If you don't want a dense thing, that's what this video is for, right? This work is a way to outline a shift away from capitalism into a potentially brighter future. So he starts off with a simple question: why should we be anti-capitalist? And really the question is capitalism good? That's what he first wants to ask, because here's some things that capitalism has brought us. iPhone. We all love iPhone. Netflix. I love catching Avatar: The Last Airbender live action on Netflix. It's one of my favorite pastimes. Vaccines. Hey, who up dying of measles these days? Not a lot of people. That's thanks to capitalism. And of course, increased life expectancy and decreased infant mortality. All these things were brought to us under the auspices of capitalism. So it's good, right? Well, capitalism has also brought us recently like complete bombing campaigns, and of course this has happened historically, and also an unimaginable wealth gap between the top 0.1% of people and the bottom 99.9% of people. And that's where we exist. If you're watching this stream, I hate to say it, you are not in the top 0.1%. You're probably not even the top 10%, if we're being for real. It also brought us the grimace shake trend on TikTok. And if that isn't enough to make you hate capitalism, I don't know what else is, because the grimace shake trend on TikTok was pretty much the epitome of capitalism. It's kind of like what we were all going for. So now that we got it, we can kind of just call it an end. Can we all agree on that? So the hallmark of capitalism is poverty in the midst of plenty. The endless search for profits under capitalism has led to many things, among those being an irreparably destroyed environment, an uneasiness for all of those at the bottom of the market, alienating work for the majority of the workforce, and restrictions of freedoms of the 99% who cannot afford to do anything other than work. But if you're here, you should know there can be another way. A better world is possible, because everyone on Earth can flourish if we reorganize our economy. And elements of this new world are already in place. That's the beauty of it. So what is capitalism? What's this thing that I'm saying is so bad? Well, the very rudimentary definition is it's commonly thought as a free market economy. You'll hear the terms free market a lot when talking about capitalism. This pretty much just means that there's minimal regulation by government, by the state. This also includes private ownership of capital, which means it's not just public or owned by the government. And it also separates the means of production from the working class. So somebody working at McDonald's is going to be paid a wage completely independent of the production that they put out. So it doesn't matter if they make 10 burgers or 50 burgers in an hour, they are getting paid the same. The only thing that changes that equation is how much money McDonald's is making. Does that make sense? That's a real broad overview of capitalism. Now, markets are not unique to capitalism. Markets can and do exist outside of capitalistic framework, but the free market, where it's minimally regulated, that's the key to capitalism. Why do people oppose it if it's so great? Well, people oppose it because capitalism makes them oppose it. Capitalism actually breeds anti-capitalism. People are just sitting at home diagnosing these systemic harms and sort of coming to the conclusion like, oh, my life sucks because of the system that we exist in. It can also be created kind of like tangentially by other ideologies. communities, like Amish communities, people can just like leave for other reasons, but then like relish or like enjoy the fact that they no longer exist in the capitalist society. Labor forces also commonly unite for fair compensation through things like unions as a way to seize back a little bit of the means of production or be more fairly compensated for what they're doing. There are two major anti-capitalist motivations that Wright points out in this book, one being class interests and one being moral values. Now, class interests are extremely important to understand. This is a poster from the 1970s that he points out. It says, class consciousness is knowing which side of the fence you're on. Class analysis is figuring out who is there with you. So it's very important to know which side of the fence you're on. And again, if you're watching this stream or this video, you're on the same side of the fence as 99+% of people. Knowing where you lie helps build friends and helps define enemies. So let's think of some really easy examples of people who should be on the same side as me and people who shouldn't be. So people who should be, the people who are oppressed by capitalism, the obvious ones, are like sweatshop workers, the people who are unemployed, gig workers, people who don't have a stable or safe access to a means to survive. And then on the other side, we have enemies. We have billionaires, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos. We have CEOs of companies. These people who ultimately the amount of labor they put in far is dwarfed by the amount of money that they receive. But class interests aren't just so cut and dry. What about small business owners? Are all small business owners enemies? What about doctors or athletes? Like, they're rich, right? So like, does LeBron James get included in Eat the Rich? Or is he also being exploited in a way as a worker? What about retail managers? We all hate our retail managers. Nobody likes retail managers. Nobody likes them. But are they the enemy or are they on our side? And really, the biggest class traitor of them all would be people who don't subscribe to my YouTube channel. I mean, come on, seriously, if you don't subscribe, you are officially getting eaten. You're part of the rich. You're part of the bourgeois decadence. So go ahead and subscribe, Hash on YT. But again, it's murky. It's not clear. It's a complexity of class issues. And these things won't always align you on the same side, right? There are moral concerns that are also playing a role. And these can cause people to act directly against their class interests. So there needs to be a way for us to criticize capitalism and at the same time make an alternative look desirable. How can we do this productively? Well, we want to use morality with historical roots, guided by three main values that he points out. The values of equality and fairness, democracy and freedom, and community and solidarity. So equality and fairness is something that is held in all notions of social justice, and we will let modern day philosopher Trisha Paytas lay the bricks for this idea of equality and fairness.
You know why I vote for Joe Biden? He quoted Hamilton. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
So she later goes on to sing the rest of it, which is, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, that is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. The United States... Oh, fuck. Is that the Declaration or is that the Constitution? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's got to be the Declaration. It is. Of course, that is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. We all knew it. I didn't Google if it was the Constitution. This is broadly accepted worldwide. You would be pretty hard-pressed to find people who genuinely believe that people should be robbed of their ability to live, people should be robbed of their ability to be free, and people should be robbed of their ability to be happy. But this wide acceptance of something like that also acknowledges the unfairness of people who were just born on the wrong side of a border. A child was born into poverty, and there's no way under capitalism to make that morally okay. It's just that person drew the short straw, and now they are forever going to be worse off than somebody born in a better situation. So that is something that we want to fix if we were to get rid of capitalism. So he works with this sentence here, and we're going to break it down because, like I said, he writes very densely, but he knows that. So he's going to break it down with us. He says, to define equality, he says, in a just society, all persons would have broadly equal access to the material and social means necessary to live a flourishing life. So let's break down that a little bit. Broadly equal access. What does that mean? Let's compare broadly equal access to equal opportunity. Equal opportunity would be something like the lottery, right? We can all go to the store right now and get a lottery ticket, and we all have the exact same chance to win, which is effectively zero, but we all have the exact same chance to win. That is equal opportunity. However, it is not broadly equal access, because of course people with more money can buy more lottery tickets. And this can be translated to other aspects in life as well. Think of it like if a teenager makes a mistake, or even an adult, and they commit a crime and they go to jail and they serve their time and they get out. Should that mistake follow them forever for the rest of their lives? Is that equal? Is that fair? If somebody got caught with weed when they were 16, now should they forever be considered a felon and prevented from doing things like voting or getting a stable job? Is that equal or fair? Of course, accidents can occur as well. Should an accident just make people's lives worse as a result forever? Is that equal? Is that fair? If somebody gets into a car accident and they become disabled, shouldn't we have a society that works to include that person back into society? Wouldn't that be equal and fair? So that's the idea of equality and fairness. Also, he wants to highlight the word flourishing and define what he means by flourishing. This can be measured by happiness, which of course varies person to person. The idea is that you lead a meaningful and fulfilling life in good health. The ability to chase one's life's goals by developing one's capacities and talents. This means you would have access to material means and social means to live a flourishing life. Material means, of course, being food, shelter, education, transportation, things that you can touch, material. You'd be pretty hard pressed to live a flourishing, healthy life if you did not have any food or access to food. And then social means, places to work, places for intimacy, places to have autonomy and make your own decisions. And then being free of social stigma, of course, based on anything from race, gender, sexuality, and many, many other things. Also, he focuses on the idea of environmental justice being distributed accordingly. Now, Swifties, look away, because this is just going to be used as an example. Of course, we all know that the rich contribute to climate change more than the poor. They're the ones taking the private jet planes. They're the ones with these massive homes or driving their cars everywhere. But it's the poor people, it's the everybody else that is paying for their actions. In an equal and fair society, that would not be the case. The people who are polluting the world more would be the ones getting justice served for it. Yes, pretty much equity. All of this is what I mean. He writes so deep. This is just equity, but he spells it out. He wants it to be, if you just, I don't know if equity is a buzzword, but he wanted it to be very, very accessible. And so by doing that, he wrote like 17 pages on equality and fairness. He also wants to make it a point to say in an equal and fair society, future generations would have the same or similar access or better to social and material means to live flourishing lives as the present generation. At this point, our society is not doing that. Every single day that goes by, we are assuring a worse future for our kids, our grandchildren, our grandchildren's grandchildren, because global warming is not being reversed. Then he moves on to democracy and freedom. He says, all people would have broadly equal access to the necessary means to participate meaningfully in decisions about things that affect their lives. Now, democracy does not implicitly impose on freedom. Some people believe that by creating laws, you are limiting freedoms, which is why you have people in today's worlds that like go off about free speech absolutism and all that nonsense. But he argues both democracy and freedom revolve around the value of self-determination, or the ability to do what you want. So laws enforce binding rules to limit freedoms. That is true. By putting out a law, I am restricting your freedom to murder. I am restricting your freedom to steal. I am restricting your freedom to cut me off at a red light. How about you stop doing that? Don't cut me off anymore. Okay? It's illegal. This ain't a fully free country. Don't cut me off at the red light. But these laws are set in place to prevent others from restricting my right to freedom. If you murder me, I no longer have a great way to pursue happiness, do I? So that's why these laws exist. And deciding on these laws democratically can help ensure fair restrictions. Now, of course, a lack of true democracy can lead to unfair laws, such as Jim Crow laws and anti-LGBTQ laws that we see today. But overall, a democratically decided on law would be best for the community. Speaking of community and solidarity, people ought to cooperate with each other, not simply because of what they personally receive, but also from a real commitment to the well-being of others, of moral obligation that is right to do. So community is your classic helping the old lady across the street because it's nice. You aren't expecting to get anything out of it. You're just doing it because you're helping each other. Community can also include your families. You don't raise your child as a return on investment, because that's a weird thing to do. You raise your child the right way because you believe it to be good and true. That's important to community. In a fully capitalistic society, you would be raising a child in order to make money. And that's bad. And of course, solidarity would be more of the collective action to achieve a common goal. And that's where we get the phrase, united we stand, divided we fall. Now, these also can be used negatively, and that's the bad part about it. Inevitably, you're going to create an in-group and an out-group. And when you create out-groups like the KKK as a hate group that was created solely to combat like the civil rights solidarity, obviously that's bad. Ideally, that wouldn't exist at all. So for instance, you have the in-group of Troy Bolton basketball. He's over there being cool playing basketball. Meanwhile, you have Troy Bolton singing. He's singing his pipes out to Vanessa Hudgens, and everybody thinks he's lame and a loser. And Vanessa Hudgens is like, no, Troy Bolton / Zac Efron, you need to come and hang out with me. And he's like, I can't, you're lame. We don't want that. That's bad. So why should we be anti-capitalist? Because we don't want to be Troy Bolton basketball. We want to be Hannah Montana, best of both worlds. Okay, I didn't watch the rest of High School Musical. I don't know if he plays basketball and sings at the same time, but I know Hannah Montana does it. So that's what we want, and capitalism is preventing that from happening. The second chapter goes in to the diagnosis and critique of capitalism. So the anti-capitalist platform is pretty much that capitalism is just a zero-sum game. There are no winners. There are rich and poor people perpetually competing both against each other and against themselves. There's overproduction that leads to waste. You will not be hard fought to find a restaurant overproducing food and then throwing it away, as opposed to giving it to people who need it or just not producing the waste in general. There are wars fought over resources for capital. Anti-capitalist platform also focuses on capitalism preventing equality, democracy, and community. The criticisms of capitalism related to these values are frequent. So here it is with equality and fairness. Capitalism breeds high levels of economic inequality, and this is not an accident. This is by design. As you can see in the United States from 1975 to 2015, the share of income earned by the top 1% has more than doubled, and I'm sure in the last 10 years it's gone up even more. This is by design. This was not an accident. There are three broad issues when it comes to equality and fairness, that being class and exploitation, competition and risk, and disruptive economic growth. So when it comes to class and exploitation, the idea of work is that people need jobs more than the employer needs an individual's labor. This inherently creates an imbalance at workplaces because the worker can always be replaced by another worker who needs a job. However, it is much harder as a worker to find a new job. All to that to be said, the rich are rich because the poor are poor. When it comes to competition and risk, capitalism creates winners and losers, and it creates far more losers than it does winners. Winning once makes it easier to win again, and losing once makes it easier to lose again. And poor people are way less able to insure themselves against economic insecurity. These are just two headlines I grabbed. One's from April 11th of last year, saying with inflation stubbornly high, 58% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck in April of 2023. 58%, the majority of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. Not even a year earlier, Elon Musk bought Twitter for $44 billion. Now, I'm sure I don't have to point out why that's an insane headline to write. $44 billion effectively thrown away because his ego couldn't take getting made fun of on a platform he didn't own, versus the majority of Americans, hundreds of millions of people, billions of people in the world who do not have economic security. There's also disruptive economic growth because companies are constantly trying to outperform others in the market, which is great for that company. It creates innovations. That's how we get things like Baja Blast 2. They made more Baja Blast flavors, folks, and they're great. But it also creates losers. And when companies lose, people lose jobs. And often the skills that they accrue in these jobs are non-transferable. So now they are at a disadvantage when they get back into the labor market. And this constant demand for profit becomes completely unstable to workers. There's the famous tweet from Drill Night: America isn't a country, it's 4 defense contract companies in a trench coat stacked on top of each other. Now below I don't have the defense contract companies, but you can see 10 food brands own all of those brands. All of those brands of food are owned by 10 food brands major. And if Coca-Cola, whose direct competitor is PepsiCo, was successful in their war and they like destroyed PepsiCo in the marketplace, everybody who works at all those factories would just get like fired. They would all get out of a job, and Coca-Cola like doesn't have to give them a job. And so all these people have been working as drivers, as warehouse supervisors, as people who were doing the HR for, like, all of them are out of a job completely. And that's by design in capitalism. So when it comes to democracy and freedom, there are 5 main arguments that he says support the criticism that capitalism prevents democracy and freedom. One of those being alienating workers from decisions. If you look across the Midwest, there are so many empty factories. And it's not like those factories just grew out of a factory seed and then they showed up there and then they were like, nobody wants to work in these factories and they just got left. There used to be bustling economy in the Midwest, in a city like Detroit, for example. But what happened was the companies decided, it'll be cheaper if we just produce all this stuff overseas and then import it. And so they just did that. They just moved production out of the city and alienated all of their workers, got them all fired. And now you have like just ghost towns where entire sections of cities are unlivable almost. That was done at the behest of capital. There's also political interest in capital. It's illegal for a special interest group to directly pay a politician, but capitalism did this really cool thing where they made it legal to pay a lobbyist who then pays the politician. So like Coca-Cola can just like, instead of paying the politician directly, they can just pay a lobbyist and that lobbyist will pay the politician, be like, by the way, this is from Coca-Cola. Super sick. The wealthy also have access to political power, especially, and this is access that poor people don't have. So wealthy can get away with things and also change the system for their benefit in a way that the poor cannot do. The workplace is organized unfairly in a way that is like vulturistic between workers, in a way that you're supposed to be anti-boss in this idea, but it makes you anti-other worker, which is super cool. And there's a lack of real freedom. You don't really have the ability to do what you want under capitalism. You don't have true freedom because you can't say no to a lot of things. If you're poor and your boss says, hey, I need you to come in today, you don't really have much of a choice because you need the hours. You need to work that job in order to survive. You need to keep your job. And maybe if you say no, your boss might think about firing you. So you don't really have the choice, let alone if you want to take like a 3-month vacation because you've never been to Japan and you really want to go to Japan. You aren't allowed to do that. We aren't allowed that actual freedom. Rich people are. There's a quote here from The Wealth of Nations written by Adam Smith, where he says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." Which all in all just pretty much says capitalism creates 2 main motivators for existing: greed and fear. You want more money, that way you're safer from being poor because you have a fear of being poor, which of course is understandable because being poor is not good in our society. It sucks to be poor. And what's even better about this is CEOs can actually have this false upholding of community values and be individually generous and seem like good guys. Like for instance, Jeff Bezos has a foundation that gave $640 million to help homeless families. And look, however much of that $640 million actually went to help homeless families definitely helped them a lot. But you know what's crazy is that Jeff Bezos has an ability to give away $640 million, allegedly, through a fund. Meanwhile, his workers are paid an average of $17 an hour. So it's this backward system to where CEOs can sort of have this like community value, but actually they're just doing that by stealing money from their own workplace community. Because workers are competing for jobs against other workers, and employees compete for promotions against fellow employees. There is no sense of community or solidarity within the workplace. Now, traditionally, it's been theorized that eventually capitalism would breed class warfare, but this has never been fully realized. This is where you get the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The solidarity within the working class has been completely fragmented. Things like the culture war topics that you constantly hear on the news and people just constantly arguing about these things, those are intentionally created to drive wedges between the working class in order to fragment their power. In fact, on the last Leftist Book Club, we talked about that a little bit when it came to white women and their feminism and how they were fragmented away from the black slaves' emancipatory causes. It's a very, very common tool. The bourgeois, however, the rich, they understand class solidarity much better than the working class does. They know to defend their own because they know about class solidarity. Proletarians, however, they sometimes get tricked into this idea and the fact that they are a temporarily embarrassed billionaire and someday they will be rich. Therefore, I just got to pull myself up by the bootstraps. Now, here comes the big skepticism. It's totally normal to have skepticism on the critiques of capitalism. Some people might even say like, well, we don't even know if these problems solely derive from capitalism. Unemployment is an issue potentially because the labor force lacks the skills that the companies require. Therefore, they're unhireable. Maybe the lack of proper education in the country is due to poor political policies and not because of capitalism removing funds from education. And maybe people are stuck in poverty because they've created a culture of poverty and they lack family values, which leads to lasting poverty. These are all skeptic critiques when people talk about capitalism. And the second critique that is the second skepticism in critiques. And secondly, some question whether any alternative could actually be better. And if there is a better alternative, there's no real attractive way to get there. This is a very common skepticism when I've talked to people about this. It's like, yeah, capitalism sucks, but is socialism really any better? Or getting to socialism would suck so much that it's probably better just to fix capitalism. So these skeptics shouldn't just be hand waved away. We should be able to meet them and be able to retort and be able to talk with them and understand where they're coming from. Because capitalism is not the only issue in modern society. It's a lot of it. It's the cause a lot of it, but it's not the only issue. And the rest of the book will focus on ways to transition away from capitalism, which will address the second skeptic. We can take a little bit of a breather. It's a little bit less dense here. So these are varieties of anti-capitalism in chapter 3. So we need to move on from capitalism, but change is scary, folks. It's important to recognize that radical changes have positive and negative effects in the short term. That's totally true. When you do change, there are going to be negative effects. So strategies must exist to combat two things. One, the false optimism of wishful thinking that like, oh, everything will just work out. And two, the pessimism that capitalism is an unconquerable beast. So to do that, we have 5 strategic logics in anti-capitalism. We can smash capitalism, we can dismantle it, we can tame capitalism, we can resist capitalism, or we can escape capitalism. Now, all of these can come together and ultimately combine to erode capitalism. That's what he implies is the best way out, but we'll get into that later. First, let's talk about smashing capitalism. So smashing capitalism, this idea is that the system is rotten and it just needs to go. There's no good in capitalism. We need to destroy it. And all in any efforts to make capitalism tolerable will eventually fail. They're effectively not worth doing. We just start from ground zero. The quote being attributed to this being, "We can birth a new world from the ashes of the old." However, historically, this hasn't worked in the long term. Whenever there's been violent revolutions, it hasn't really worked in the long term for the states that have done it. There's a lot of reasons why. One being, if a state is in the condition to go through a revolution, they're probably not in a great spot. So they're probably not set up for success anyway. Of course, foreign states love meddling when it comes to countries that are trying to do socialism or anything that's not capitalistic in structure. The United States is not a stranger to that. Of course, we have instilled a ton of terror into countries that try to do socialist programs. And there are, of course, just corrupt leaders in some places. And there are many other reasons why it has not quite worked out yet. But despite this criticism, smashing capitalism still exists as a foundational rally against the systems that be. It is still super important to like have fun little slogans like smash the patriarchy, because we can all understand that patriarchy is bad. We can all understand that capitalism is bad, but it can't just be as simple as we just need to destroy it tomorrow and then we'll rebuild. Dismantling capitalism sort of takes a completely different approach. They want to transition to democratic socialism through state-directed reforms. So you can have a mixture of private and public relations, private and public banks. You might have public access to healthcare and transportation utilities, but you can still have private firms existing. This is what currently exists. This is what's going on. But as it goes in time, we want to turn the socialism dial up and the capitalism dial down. So there's no single moment of transition. It happens over time. This does require stable democratic government and electable socialist party. If those things don't exist, then the dials can just get turned back the other way if there are no electable socialist party members running. This was actually extremely popular after World War II. That's why you see a lot in European countries. You see a lot of socialized medicine and free, if not extremely affordable colleges. That's where a lot of this stuff happens. The public transit, a lot of that was post World War II. But then neoliberalism was born in the 60s to the 90s is when it started to peak out, and has since taken over as the dominant ideology in the West. So that takes us to taming capitalism. So this doesn't really push to fully replace capitalism, but rather deal with the harms that were caused by capitalism. So the example that he uses in the book is, let's say you're newborn parents and you have a brand new baby, and that baby is giving you headaches It's a new baby. It's crying. It's waking up all the time. It's pooping on you. It sucks. They're babies. They don't know what to do. So there's two solutions to get rid of your headache. Destroy the thing causing the headache. In this case, the baby. Get rid of it. Or just take an aspirin. We'll get over it, right? So taming capitalism is the aspirin in this scenario. Because neoliberalism is actively working against this, though, it kind of doesn't feel like it's fully going to get to where you want it to be. So we already see rolling back of social programs. In the UK, they're actively trying to like defund the NHS. They've done Brexit. And there's like this growing unwillingness of people to be taxed because of our economic insecurity. If people are prosperous and they're doing well, they're less likely to like care if you're getting taxed a little bit more because you're okay. But every paycheck, a couple more dollars are coming out and you're already pushing paycheck to paycheck, you're going to be way more resistant to this kind of change. Now, resisting capitalism, this is one that doesn't actually push to gain political power. This is just done in order to make the people in power uncomfortable and theoretically force them to change because they're so uncomfortable. So this is stuff like strikes, as we can see the BLM strike. We have the BDS boycott for freedom, justice, and equality. And then we have Hunter Kaimi, who is, friend of the Judges podcast, Hunter. He talked a lot about quiet quitting, and they even went on Dr. Phil and did a thing on there. So quiet quitting was actually a way to do like an in-work boycott / protest because people just aren't getting properly compensated for their work. It was actually a super sick movement that we had for a couple months there. Lastly, we have escaping capitalism, and that ideology is like, capitalism's really strong. Let's just get the heck out of here. Let's just leave it. And so some opt to leave it. As we mentioned before, Amish people just remove themselves from the capitalist market. They just said, no, we're all right. We're going to go build our houses in like 2 hours. See you later. In the 70s, hippies chanted, turn on, tune in, drop out, with drop out meaning drop out of capitalism, of the system. However, this escaping capitalism is extremely individualistic, and you're not actually enacting change for those that are unable to participate. This is an extremely individualistic mindset. It doesn't actually enact lasting change. You're just sort of leaving it for yourself. And this takes an extreme privilege to be able to do. And it can come off as very like privilegey. Like I know that the hippies are sort of seen this way, but there's that girl on TikTok who's like blowing up, who's like rapping in the mountains of Peru or whatever. It's the same thing as like wealthy people or children of wealthy people might see the problems of capitalism, but then have the means to like buy a van and just go live out of their van and like be self-sustaining. Not everybody has access to that, especially if you have family members that need help. A more common example would be DIY culture, which is you actively deciding not to partake in the capitalistic society and saying, I'm just going to change my own oil, even though I don't know how to do it super great. And I'm going to have to watch a YouTube video now. It's going to take me 2 hours when if I just take it down to the mechanic, it's going to take them 45 minutes. It's going to save me money. And it's a way to not engage in capitalism. So all 5 of these strategic logics all have a primary objective of either neutralizing harms or transcending the system that we currently exist in. There's also a secondary objective, which he calls reforming the game of life that we live in. Is the game we're playing capitalism or socialism? That's what Smashing is trying to decide. Are the rules, can they be changed? That would be taming or dismantling. And what moves are we allowed to make within the game? That's resisting and escaping. He makes this extremely complicated explanation, comparing it to a game. And a vastly oversimplified version is that erosion of capitalism works in both ways, both by changing the game and changing how the rules are played and deciding what moves we can make. So eroding capitalism exists under the idea that no economy that can exist is purely capitalist. You can often hear people say like, well, no socialist economy or no socialist nation that existed was actually socialist. No communist country was ever actually communist. That's true. There's also never been a capitalistic society. In our current society, we have state aid and labor unions and things that are anti-capitalist. So the goal is to build better systems in the cracks of capitalism that will eventually push out capitalism entirely. A historical example of this is the change from feudal society to capitalism itself, where we had kings and queens and lords lording over entire swaths of land, and people just forced to pay into them, and they couldn't really do anything about it. But then markets were introduced inside of the feudal systems. People were able to build independence through accruing wealth by trading, and eventually that power was stripped from kings and queens and given to the merchants. And now we no longer have kings and queens. And if we do, they're in England and we don't really care because they just don't do anything. They're just sort of figureheads. They're just there to be racist and die. This is in the West. There are kings and queens and other stuff in other sections of the world, but in the West specifically. Eroding capitalism's goal is not to build from the ashes of the old world, but to build within it. This requires both spontaneous action and deliberate strategy. An example would be the support for Bernie Sanders in the United States and Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. Now, again, this author died in 2019, so he didn't see how both Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn have been completely chewed up and spit out by our systems since 2019. But their support has still worked to radicalize many, many, many youths, myself included. And so you can see how that a gradual erosion of capitalism is still taking time. It's still working. And that will lead us to a destination beyond capitalism, which is socialism as an economic democracy. So socialism is the end goal. Wright will call it democratic socialism. He's talking sort of about how the term socialism sort of has this like negatively seen like value in the West sometimes, even though in 2016, the majority of Americans under 30 would view the word favorably, and most of the world kind of sees it just like as a word. But still, he doesn't really know what word to use other than socialism. That's just the word he's using. This chapter is extremely dense. This is where the leftist theory begins, folks. I started this as a means to read more leftist theory. Here I fucking got it. This chapter is oops all leftist theory. It's so much theory. Let's break it down. If we're going to have socialism as a economic power-centered concept, let's talk about what power is. Power is the capacity to do things in the world to produce effects. There are multiple kinds of power, some being economic power, state power, and social power. Of course, economic power being the ability to create or extract resources, state power being able to create laws, and social power the ability to move masses, being able to mobilize people. The more social power in a society, the more democratic the society is. The ideal types of capitalism, statism, and socialism are never truly achievable, but they serve as templates as what we want to aim for. If you were a capitalist, if you were a statist, if you were a socialist. So the building blocks of a dem-soc economy revolve around many, many sectors. You can't just have markets. You can't just have co-ops. You can't just have democratically regulated firms. It would be foolish to put all of your eggs in one basket. So the main goal is sustainability across all markets. Each person engaged in the economy would theoretically have power to change the rules of the game democratically. They would each individually be able to choose when and where they were buying things and for what price. It's impossible to know the exact breakdown of the economy, like where the pie slices get split up. But what's important is that it allows broadly equal access for everybody in the society. And this transitions into unconditional basic income. You might have heard universal basic income. It is the same thing from what I understand. So the idea is that every resident would get enough money to live above the poverty line with no conditions attached. This would effectively completely eliminate poverty, reduce inequalities, and allow people to pursue for pleasure instead of just for profit. Because under capitalism, you need to work to live. You can't just decide to not work unless you are extremely wealthy. Under UBI, work is still an option, and plenty of people will still work because you can still accrue more money to do more things. But you could also not work. And this would increase participation in the arts and crafts and like working with your hands and stuff, like a ton. I mean, how many old curmudgeonly dudes do you know who like fucking hate like the woke and leftists? And then you talk to them about like what their ideal world looks like. And they're like, oh, I just want to live on a farm and just, you know, till the land and do woodworking. And you're like, yeah, that would exist under socialism, man. You could do that. That's the sick part. Or you could also work if you wanted to. I think it's super chill. UBI would allow support for those who are tasked with taking care of family members as well. They're taking care of their family members outside of market means. So stay-at-home parents, end-of-life care, these things that exist in our current economy, and you have to do a like cost benefit analysis to decide if it's worth to stay home with your kid while your partner works, or if you pay for a babysitter so that way you have two incomes. All of this was sort of brought into the mainstream by Andrew Yang. Now, I am not a Yang ganger. I don't think he actually believed in a traditional or in a UBI in this sense from what I remember, wasn't he saying like $1,000 a month or something? Which if you implement it as a dollar amount, it would probably just incorporate or like be weeded out through inflation. But we do have to give him props for even bringing it into the mainstream, because now UBI as a terminology, as a concept, has become way more popularized. So now the cooperative market economy is one that will be focused heavily in a socialist organization of the economy. Cooperatives focus on the members owning the means of production. These things can include consumer co-ops, credit co-ops, currently known as credit unions, producer co-ops, housing co-ops, etc. This would allow for members to have a say in both their labor and their production. The great thing about co-ops is they're geographically located. They exist where you need them. This would keep economies localized, which makes them much less likely to move away from their community. An example that I think is really funny that I think about a lot is my old boss used to talk about how people in the old days, before smartphones, people used to go down to their local bar. If you knew the right people, you'd talk to the bookie and you would make illegal sports bets. And that was chill. That's what you did. And because it was illegal, because it was off the books, you couldn't use a credit card, you couldn't use a debit card. So you pretty much had to have the cash, and you would make that bet. And even if you won or lost, that money was coming from people in the community to somebody in the community and being redistributed back into the community. When gambling was legalized, when sports gambling was legalized nationally, now you have apps like FanDuel, not sponsored, who take that money legally now away from people in the community, sends it to some CEO, and now that money is completely removed from the community. So something like illegal gambling, and this can be the same thing for like prostitution, which is why people don't say legalize sex work, they say decriminalize sex work. Same thing with drugs. We don't say, a lot of the times you don't want to legalize drugs, you want to decriminalize drugs as a means to allow money to stay local. It's one of the benefits of it. There are other reasons as well. I just think that's a really funny example, because there are other positives of like illegal gambling staying local, because the bookie knows the guy who's giving him all the money and like might actually cut the guy off from gambling, whether it be for self-interest to be like, dude, you're not going to pay me. I know you're not going to pay me if you make this bet. But FanDuel doesn't care if I keep putting on my credit card like $100 charges because I think the Colts are going to win by 4.5 points. They won't ever cut me off because they have a profit motive. So I just think that's a funny little, like, I think about it all the time of like something as simple as like FanDuel being popularized has actually made such a shift away in small communities' ability to be anti-capitalist. And in a broader sense, you could say the same thing about like Walmart taking over and pushing out all the small businesses. It's the same idea. Now, the cooperative market economy is unlikely to be implemented unless the rules of the game change. The UBI would help reduce the reliance on a market in order to make money. So that would increase the amount of co-ops being made. It'd also be a nice way to conversion of private programs to some public ones, specialized public credit to fund upstart cooperatives. That way, not only wealthy people could start a cooperative, and publicly funded training programs, because training is expensive and it would allow co-ops to be ran properly. If you have any more interest in co-ops, I highly recommend following Madeline Pendleton across all the apps. They're awesome. They run a co-op, I believe, in LA. I don't really know exactly. I think it's on the West Coast somewhere. But they run a co-op with multiple employees, and she talks constantly about how the company works, and it's just like awesome. Like they each just make like 80K, and then at the end of the year, they just like take all the extra money they made and just like buy a gift for everybody. And it sounds like heaven to work at, and like people can just take time off. That is what a co-op should look like. People working together to control the way that they work. So I can't recommend Madeline enough for their content. There is also a social and solidarity economy. This includes things like nonprofits, mutual aids, volunteer programs, community organizations, and churches, things that create money flow that don't immediately turn into profit. Under capitalism, a lot of these arise after a tragedy has already occurred or as a result of poor conditions already existing. So things like cancer. GoFundMe actually posted this. 6 cancer fundraising tips to help you raise more money. We are, as a society in the United States, when we get cancer, we make GoFundMes to try to help get medicine. That's where we're at under capitalism. When a natural disaster strikes, like Hurricane Katrina in 2005, 6, like Hurricane Katrina, it becomes a scramble to get money there. And we have systems in place. We have FEMA. We have government systems in place, but they're underfunded and underutilized. And so ultimately the efforts don't work. They don't end up helping. Under a socialist organization of the economy, we would work to prevent these conditions from existing in the first place as best we can, or if they do happen, an immediate and effective response when they do occur, because there's no profit motive. The removal of the profit motive, a lot more achievable to just throw money at things. Like, well, we don't care if we're not making an extra $1 billion this year. We'll just throw it and help the people who need it. He also talks about democratizing capitalist firms. So this is where your workplace would be more enjoyable to work at. So some of this already occurs. We have health and safety regulations, which the worst guy at your work hates safety regulations. As a former safety officer for my company, I'm of course biased, but health and safety regulations are such a boon for workers because they restrict the company from putting you in dangerous situations. Because left to their own devices, companies would and have done that. They would work you more than 40 hours a week if it weren't for democratizing in the workplace. They would work you for less pay if not for democratizing in the workplace. That's like things like minimum wage come into place. Because capitalism necessitates a power imbalance between the boss and the worker. Socialism, however, would allow workers to have power over their labor, and unions are things that are actively working towards this now, as an example. However, in the United States, over the past 70 years, 50, 60 years here, the percent of unemployed, the percent of union membership in the United States has gone down drastically. We've almost at a third of what it used to be in the 1960s. This is an active campaign by neoliberalism as a means to help separate workers from the means of production. This is why part of why we have such an increased gap in the top 1% and the bottom 99+% of people in the United States. Banking would also change fundamentally because it would become a public utility in the same way when you turn your water on, you expect there to be water coming out, clean, potable water. Obviously, that doesn't exist everywhere, but you expect it because it's a utility. Banks would no longer exist as they do because they currently exist to make money off of you. Banks, the place where you put your money, make money off of you, which is an insane middleman. They are the car salesman of money handling. They do not need to exist because banks have created an infinite money glitch, but IRL. How did they do that? Well, here's how they did it. Step one, give out a loan. I go to a bank and I say, hey, can I have a loan for $100,000? I really want to invest in a super sick Gundam model collection. That way I can show it off and make my best friend jealous. The bank says, oh, we don't have $100,000, but we'll just ask the central bank. We'll ask the government for money. So they get a loan from central bank at an interest rate much lower than the one that they're giving me. Then they give that money to me, but the central bank is like, man, I didn't have $100,000. We'll just make it up. We'll just make up the money. It doesn't matter. We'll get the money back anyway in interest, so it doesn't matter if we make up the money. And then the bank profits at the expense of me, the guy who just wanted to build a humble $100,000 Gundam model collection. This is completely asinine that this is how capitalism has dictated that banks exist. This infinite money glitch should not exist for any reason other than to make rich people more money. Now, there's also non-market economic organization. We're almost through the theory, guys, I promise. There are economic factors that exist outside of markets currently that don't have much place in capitalism right now. In socialism, you would see an innate increase in these sectors. So some of these sectors might include state provision of goods and services. So stuff like caregiving and parks and healthcare and transit and education, all these things that you look at and you're like, this should be free. The state would provide these things through taxing. They can also be supplied through the market and being subsidized through the government. That's also an option. Libraries today already operate under these auspices. Like you go to a library and you are probably paying close to $0, if not, if not $0, because you're paying in taxes already. If you live in the jurisdiction of the library, you walk in, you pick out books, you pick out movies, and you rent them. And there's going to be a nominal fee, a very small fee, if you don't replace them. But that fee isn't going to profit the library. It is you choosing to keep the book or whatever you rented. And it's sort of like you paying for other people not being able to receive that book while they're waiting to get it. So it's literally to each their needs. These things already exist. So there's clear paths for them to exist more. Another thing that would grow is peer-to-peer collaborative production. Now, peer-to-peer is already a pretty well-known system, and it's very, very effective. Think about this, the fact that Wikipedia in the year of our Lord, 2024, is free is one of the greatest anti-capitalist movements in modern times. Wikipedia is the largest free place to access information. That's such a boon on economy. And the fact that it's free is so amazing. GitHub is a site that if you're online, you'll use relatively frequently because it is open source coding. And what's great about open source coding, as Kyako brings up LimeWire, when I was a kid, I used LimeWire. And the thing about LimeWire is it's of course peer-to-peer, but there's no real way to know if it's a virus when you're downloading on LimeWire. But the nice thing about things like GitHub or Nexus Mods or even in some ways the Pirate Bay or Wikipedia is if somebody uploads something or makes an edit and it's malicious, because they're open source, because anybody can go in and look at it, and because there's a community there, and because there's no profit motive on any of these sites, if somebody uploads something that's malicious, it will get taken down, it will get reported, or somebody will call it out. There will be immediate community action to remove it. And it's great. It's awesome. And it's free. And none of these people get paid to upload it. It's amazing. If people can't understand the concept of people doing labor for free, point them to fan fiction websites. People love doing work for free, I promise. As long as they get a perceived value out of it. In this case, making a sick-ass mod. Making Elminster have big ol' naturals. That's worth it in their book. Another thing that would grow is the knowledge commons. So this is kind of in that same vein, but currently, as laws exist now, IP laws exist as a way to sort of protect an investment into research. So if a lab wants to do research, a company will give them money, but that company will understandably want to recoup the value that they've put in. So they create IP laws that says anything you create, we will have distinct sole ownership of for X amount of years. Nobody else can have access to this proprietary invention, which makes sense from a capitalist perspective. However, this also will prevent that important tech, whatever it is, from being shared. So now companies will have to try to backwards engineer things, which takes more money, more resources just to create the same thing in order to compete in a market. The removal of this profit motive would just allow for technology to be bettered and spread more easily, right? This is especially important for things like pharmaceutical companies where, insulin was incredibly expensive in the United States. This is especially important for things like pharmaceutical companies because by creating a drug that's super important and then intentionally keeping that IP, that way you can make more money instead of helping people with the drug, is evil. That is just, there's no other way to describe it. It is evil. The fact that when the COVID vaccine was created, that the United States held that IP through Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, they held that IP because they wanted to make money by selling it to other countries, is absolutely evil during a global pandemic. But that is what capitalism calls for. So let's talk about anti-capitalism and the state. Because the problem of the capitalist state exists. Because with how powerful capitalism is, wouldn't the state just destroy any and all attempts to thwart it? Doesn't that make sense? The state is controlled by powerful elites. The state is designed to push capitalism. It's a capitalist state. So it's taxing citizens from income that they earn in a market economy. There's no reason why the state would want to remove markets from the economy. There's no reason why the state would want to get rid of political races being more achievable for the elites, because the elites are the ones giving them money. And the state also loves the idea of private property being held in a very high regard and therefore protects the private property. How can we beat this? Well, it's important to examine the internal contradictions of capitalism that exist innately. So let's look into some of these contradictions. So state systems are inherently capitalist in an ideal capitalist state. We used that phrase before. And we cannot have a purely capitalistic state. Every measure, therefore, to promote democracy is an anti-capitalist state movement. So capitulations to the people must be made to maintain power, right? You can't just keep fucking over citizens because eventually they will revolt. And so what happens over time is you have capitalism and it keeps getting diluted by democracy and eventually have a weaker capitalism. So it's an inherent contradiction in capitalism. There are self-destructive tendencies everywhere in capitalism. Here are just a few. I'm sure you've thought of more in your free time or noticed them. But every employer wants to pay the smallest wages possible to their employee. That way they make more money on their bottom line. However, this gives less buying power to their consumers and therefore will hurt the employer's business. So people can't buy money if you're not paying them enough, but if you pay them more, you lose money. It's inherently contradictory. Providing good on-the-job training will increase a workplace's production, but providing training is expensive. And if another company provides this training, then I can just wait until that person's done getting training over there, and then I'll just hire them. That way I don't have to pay for their training, and now they've been trained. So the other company recognizes that and is like, we're just not training anybody anymore. Capitalism has inspired companies to not train properly because they don't want to lose money, which is inherently anti-capitalist. The market is also prone to speculative bubbles, which can be manipulated. So investors will see a stock rising. They will take out loans to artificially inflate the stocks by putting money into that stock. Then they will sell the stocks at a value. Now, some people won't sell the stocks in time and they will lose money, and the company will artificially get depreciated. Think about Dogecoin. I know it's a meme. Think about all of the crypto. The entire thing of crypto was that it was an unregulated, non-fungible token, right? But when you unregulate it and you have pure capitalism, there's nothing protecting consumers from getting screwed over. Yeah, and like you're saying, Walmart employs thousands of people across the United States. And as somebody who's worked in retail, a different store, granted, they just throw you in the deep end and you sink or swim. Because again, at the end of the day, you need that job more than that job needs you. They'll just hire somebody else. Unless you have like Amazon, who is currently like, they fired so many people because they don't want to pay them more that they are now having trouble like getting people to work in their distribution centers, which is again, another contradiction within capitalism. So when every company and every individual is competing endlessly, it creates far more losers than winners. There can only be one winner. Second place is just the first loser. So left to its own devices, capitalism would inherently be self-defeating. That's why capitalism relies on state programs to offset these consequences. Welfare programs actually allow capitalism to exist in their current state because it allows poor people to just barely survive. And therefore, these poor people can just keep remaining cogs in the capitalist machine. Italian philosopher Gramsci says, we need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will, which is this fucking dope quote. I mean, fucking, hey, hats off to Gramsci. Hey, way to go, bud. Wright here argues that we need to have optimism of the intellect just a little bit to help towards eroding capitalism. So what is one of the grounds for optimism of the intellect that we can maybe hope that one day capitalism will be fully eroded? Well, there's this great thing called global warming and the inevitable heat death of the universe. So we can't just keep existing in this way forever. Eventually, everybody will die. This is the optimism part of it, guys. This is what he means by optimism. Because eventually global warming will force neoliberalism to end and make a change. The market will not freely spend money to offset the effects of climate change. There's no reason for a capitalist to try to build like seawalls or try to help move people on their own volition, even though capitalists will profit from the production of these changes. A good example of this is like, think about wartime production. Capitalists love engaging in wartime production. That doesn't mean capitalists, like specifically CEOs of companies, are going to actively invite a war on their own soil. They might start a war, across the globe because they aren't directly affected by it. They're only making money. But capitalists wouldn't invite a war on the United States. That's what a global warming is. It's a war on themselves. So they're not going to like freely be like, well, let's just help it out. Also, I always equate this to the student loan crisis. If you've been following me for a while, I've said in the podcast before, I don't believe in paying off my student loans. I make the absolute minimum payment I can because I just innately believe eventually all student loans will have to be forgiven. This is something that is sitting as a like dark like ball on American government that so many people are getting screwed over by student loans and it's hurting the economy so bad. Eventually, neoliberalism will have to deal with it. Another thing that he writes about is technological advancements in AI, where AI will eventually create an over-automation of jobs and a reduction in the workforce, which will demand a different way of life innately. So what responses can a state take to help solve these issues? One would be UBI. We talked about it. Another would be publicly funded goods and services. These are all things we've talked about before. They would help curb global warming and the effects of it, and AI and student loans and all these things. The ability for people to live not in the poverty line or under the poverty line. Neoliberalism has, though, eroded democracy in 4 major ways. What he's talking about, democratizing the state. This was pretty dense here. I tried to bring it down just to like 4 sentences. We'll see how it worked. Global movement of capital means states must be aware of capital interest. So the United States can't just like immediately be like, all right, we're socialists now. Not that they ever would, but they can't just do that because capitalists would just move to surrounding countries. So you have to be aware of capital interests, even if you want to exist in an anti-capitalist way. Deregulating the financial sector also increased the power of finance to affect state policy. That one's pretty obvious. Money makes laws more than people make laws in modern capitalism. Privatizing state services removes the ability of state to govern. Our fucking garbage got privatized. Like, we have a company from Chicago the company from Chicago, which is well over 2 hours away, does the garbage for our city when we previously had garbage done by the city, like by the government, which was awesome because it was done. It kept the jobs local. All the money was made local, and it wasn't being done for profit. And the reason why they privatized state services is because in the short term, it might save you money. I'm sure the city got money. They got paid by whatever waste service. And they said, oh, and by the way, we'll charge the same amount for garbage pickup. We're not going to charge your citizens more. And then over time, they will charge us more. And the money that they got runs away. If you want to watch a very interesting video about this, there's a great video about Chicago. Let me look up Chicago. It's a great video by Climate Town called "Chicago Doesn't Own Its Streets," and it just explains how the city of Chicago sold away their own parking meters in an effort to like make short-term money, but has now lost like billions of dollars of tax revenue or like of public revenue because they prioritize short-term revenue. It's ridiculous. And when you, as a capitalist society, privatize state services, now the city of Chicago has like a 50-year contract and they can't help their own citizens because they're at the best of a company. Drives me insane. Weakening the labor movement removes power from working class. Of course, the working class has been getting reduced in power year and year over. Neoliberalism itself must be defeated if we wish to democratize democracy. Neoliberalism, if I haven't said, just being a way of being capitalism. It's capitalism, pretty much. So he laid out 4 critical factors to achieve destruction of neoliberalism and democratizing democracy. Firstly, democratically empowered decentralization. Now, you'll hear a lot of neoliberals talk about calling for small government. This is not an overall saying that small government is good, because when they call for small government, it's that way they can do undemocratic things. However, decentralization for things that can be democratically decided at smaller levels is key into making a system that works. As an example, my town mayor shouldn't have to contact President Biden, Joseph Robinette Biden himself, to install a new stop sign, right? We can all understand why that wouldn't make sense. But these bureaucratic problems have been intentionally introduced by neoliberals as a means to undermine people's perception of state-run facilities. We talked about the DMV earlier, but think about how you dread going to the post office or the DMV because it's going to take forever, right? And these are publicly funded things. They're not done for a profit. They are intentionally underfunded. That way people trust government less. This is not a conspiracy. This is true. This is fact. So being able to do this in a way that works is super important for a democratic socialist government. We also need new forms of citizen participation, which would allow people to easily and effectively contribute. That would increase overall democracy, of course. New institutions for democratic representation would be great. He recommends institutions which randomly select citizens to participate. We already have a system like this, which is jury duty, which people don't like going to jury duty, but it's super important to have. But this would also be like, you get randomly selected to serve on a board for your town meeting, your town council. That way your input is used, and you can decline it. You don't have to do it, but it's just ways to help institute more and more democratic representation. And then he also talks about democratizing electoral rules of the game, pretty much making it so we actually have a democratic system. In the United States, as it exists, we do not have a democratic system. Your vote does not count as one vote. When, as much as liberals would like you to believe, when you vote third party or you don't vote, you are not voting for the opposition. I live in Illinois. If I don't vote for Joe Biden, I guarantee you all of the delegates from Illinois will still be going to Joe Biden. So how do we get to socialism? Well, we need to find some agents of transformation. That is the idea of the last chapter of the book. Ways to find people to actually enact the change. So there must be both individuals and organizations pushing for this change. Resisting capitalism, having protests, having social movements, these are centered on growing active members. They don't actively aim to gain state power. Like, people don't do protests as a means to get elected into government, but they help create a place for like-minded individuals to go and to push for a cause and learn and grow. They can become complementary to creating groups with political power. Normally this is done with political parties, but like in modern times, social media has become a major source of influence. So much so that TikTok's getting banned. And look at Jimmy Fallon, he can't believe it. Jimmy Fallon can't believe a world would exist without TikTok. Where is he going to get all of his new ideas for his show if he's not stealing it from content creators? But that's just proof to show you how things other than political parties have power. So much so that they're actively trying to change social media. Whether it be Elon Musk buying Twitter, whether it be the United States government trying to ban TikTok, or even people trying to buy forms of traditional media like Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post. These are ways that that capitalists understand that social media does have power. So the problem of collective agency comes into play here. Now, agency is just the ability or the fact that people make their own decisions that are influenced by their lived experiences and biases. People make their own decisions. This can apply to individuals, but it can also apply to collectives. Humans are not perfectly logical. We will never make a decision perfectly based off of a logic thing. And that's not even necessarily a good thing. Emotion is an incredibly important thing to have when it comes to making decisions, but we are not robots. Look, I'll show you, I'll prove it right now that I'm not a robot. Let me solve this CAPTCHA. This one seems a little hard. Let me solve the next one then. I see an R. Okay, no, we're not doing words. Let's do pictures. I know it's not the bottom right. Regardless, I promise I'm not a robot, but the important part with all of this is people getting in and starting to do anti-capitalist work. One of the things that boils down to is people's identities and how important identities are to a movement. Because people have all kinds of identities. It can be anything from gender, race, class, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or it can be that, hey, you like jazz. Maybe you're like Jerry Seinfeld and you like jazz. Maybe being a New Yorker is an important part of your identity and you identify as a New Yorker. These are all real things. And sometimes certain parts of your identity are more important than others. Imagine you are a fan of Gale from Baldur's Gate 3 and you're interacting with a fellow baseball enjoyer because you're at a Chicago Cubs game. You don't need to tell the guy at the Chicago Cubs game that you're a little sick, twisted freak who likes the worst character from Baldur's Gate 3. But that's still part of your identity. It just isn't important right now. Likewise, when you're at the Fans of Gale Club and you and one other member show up, you don't have to talk about the Cubs. Because identities also aren't only self-ascribed, they can be ascribed to you whether or not they're accurate. So the concept of white passing is an example that's commonly mentioned. Now, how many of you know this white guy? This is conservative commentator Hank Pecker, okay? He's a conservative commentator, he's a white guy, loved Trump, obviously has the Trump Rambo thing in the background. What if I told you that was the same guy as this woke Turkish Muslim socialist Hassan Piker? Because while Hassan is an extremely non-white sounding name, and when people hear Hassan, he will be treated as a non-white person. If you just look at Hassan, he will not be identified as a non-white person regularly. He is white passing. People will see him on the street and just think, oh, that's just a white guy. That's Hank Pecker. So identities aren't just things you ascribe to yourself. It can also be things people ascribe to you. Why that's important is because sharing identity can help facilitate sustained collective action. And this is why class consciousness is so important, because it unites everyone. It doesn't matter what myriad other identities you have. I can have 0 identities shared with somebody, except we are both part of the proletariat. And that is super important because that encompasses 99% of people. Plus, 99% plus. Now, what's important, though, is that this identity does not erase your other identities, but rather it gives a bridge between otherwise different people. I have met plenty of people just talking about being leftist online through our Discord that I otherwise would never have access to or would have ever talked to. People who live in different states. And it's awesome because participating in social action gives you a sense of identity and can change how people are. I now identify as a leftist. That's part of my identity. And someone identifying as a Democrat and a liberal and a leftist are 3 completely different things. There might be things that we share in those identities, but they're completely different things. And it's great to be part of a group that allows you to interact with more people. Now, interests are tied to identities, but they are not the same thing. Your identity might be that you're Catholic, but your interest is you're going to make abortion illegal because it goes against your Catholic identity. People also can act against their own interests, and it happens very, very frequently. Interests may be tied very closely to your identity. For example, trans people are going to innately be more interested in furthering trans rights and trans visibility because it's close to them, and that makes sense, right? But people of different identities can adopt others' interests as a collective means to a better society. I am not represented on this flag. I am not any of these colors. I'm a straight cis white guy. But that doesn't mean I can't have the flag and understand that it's good. That's the important part of identities and your interests. So all that being said is that interests are important because it allows other people to share in movements. Values are also extremely important because values are beliefs that people hold of what is good. Opposing values can be used to further one's own interests, of course. So as an example, conservatives love to push tax cuts for the rich as a solution to poverty, something like trickle-down economics. This furthers the interest of rich people, but they're using the value that poverty should not exist to do that. So people can use values that they don't actually agree with and manipulate them. But values are extremely important to hold and to be critical of your own values. A solid value system can be applied to almost any situation and withstand the test of time. There are many, many people that you look at their history, Joe Biden being one of them. If you look at his history, he has a dark, dark past in United States government, anywhere from 2008 to the 1990s to the 80s when he first started. And did he start in the 70s? He's old as shit. I don't know if you knew that. Breaking news, Joe Biden old as shit. But I say that to mean it's good for people to change their values. It's not bad now that Biden supports gay marriage, even though not that long ago he didn't. It's good that he theoretically has changed his stance on that. But if you have a solid value system, you will not find yourself needing to change your values very often. So someone like Bernie Sanders, that's why you can go back in time. And Bernie Sanders isn't perfect. He's had a lot of missteps, especially contemporarily with Israel-Palestine. But you can go back and see Bernie Sanders marching for the right things in history very, very often because his value system is correct. And that's really, really important to have. There's also a very, very important step when it comes to getting people to join the cause, getting actors in order to promote a socialist reorganization of the economy. One of those things is overcoming privatized lives because most Americans now live their lives pretty insulated. They go to work and then they come home from work and then they're with their family. They maybe have a small group of friends, but increasing interactions with people builds a stronger anti-capitalist community. Just being more in tune with your local community is really, really important. Churches provide this. People go to church and they are with a community that they would otherwise never be around or have time to talk to you. But often churches, of course, move in the conservative direction as opposed to the progressive direction. Maybe the progressive version would be like D&D table. I don't know. What's like the most progressive version of this? A rock climbing gym. Like that way all the lesbians can meet up. I don't know. Wealthy people are also often given more time to do this. And that's just always innately true for social and political directions. Like wealthy people, unfortunately, just have easier access to doing things. Poor people can't be fucked. They don't have time or the money to spend to do this. So it's important to do what you can when you can. But this is such a keystone in American society that this is a meme that was made by a conservative person that is like, normal people hate their neighbors, which is probably like true. I mean, dissecting the word normal is like, most people won't talk to their neighbor, but people should talk to their neighbor. There's also fragmented class structures, and we've touched on this before, that most people that exist within the working class, but they don't have working class solidarity. Marx actually tried to predict an inevitable uprising, saying the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. However, the world is much different now than it was 150 years ago. Many in the working class have bought into this American dream of pulling up your bootstraps, and you yourself can become a billionaire. Hey, I totally get it, Mini Boop. I guess specifically with your neighbors, it's not like your direct neighbors, but it is like joining community programs in order to like strengthen local ties. Again, these are his words, not mine. I don't talk to my neighbors. Fuck that. There's no chance in hell I'm talking to my neighbors. They're definitely racist. For example, I think like even Discord, right? Like our Judgy's podcast has a Discord where like people can meet and talk and like grow and talk. And like even in this chat, we have people like talking actively and trying to work stuff out. Like this is really important community building to do. Like it's just really, really important to do stuff like that. I think that's like the main goal. It's like not to just be shut in and like only talk about, only do work, like go to work, get home from work, watch Netflix, go to bed. And that's totally fine if that's what you do. I think his argument is if you want to actively push for change, we can't have everybody doing that. You know what I mean? There's also problems with competing sources of identity. So contemporary progressive politics have often revolved around securing rights and opportunities for oppressed classes, being POC, LGBTQ, people who are ESL. Like that's contemporary progressive politics focus on that. But these identities are fighting for equality, and they can sometimes be misinformed or misdirected. So these identities fighting for equality can sometimes be misinformed and actively work against anti-capitalist movements. An example that will come up often is white feminism. And here's a quote from Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a civil rights advocate and intersectional feminist. If you see inequality as a them problem or unfortunate other problem, that's a problem. And a protesting sign that says feminism without intersectionality is just white supremacy. And again, when we reviewed this book on the last Leftist Book Club, we talked extensively, or rather, Angela Davis wrote extensively about how white women would often abandon black women's seeking for the same rights in an effort to further white women's cause. So white feminism is just an example of something where identities can cross over and actually actively harm. So this is something that we need to keep an eye on. Intersectionality is super, super important to understand. The British actually understood this and used it effectively when they did colonization. When they would colonize places, they would go to like India, for example, and they would, instead of leaving a British person in charge of the local town or community, they would instill a local leader to watch over the colonized people. This was now this local leader's best chance to like become British, even though the British community would never fully accept an Indian person. But that person would have a conflicting source of identity because they would now be the leader and be Indian, and the leader would overtake the Indian identity in him more often than not. And oftentimes the leaders that they put in place were much more cruel than the British leaders that they would leave in place. So the British knew this and used it to their advantage when colonizing. They used it many, many times over. So how does all this translate to real life, real world politics? It's a big question. Should progressive politics be done in a new party or use an existing one? It's a very complicated answer, but what he wants to outline here is very, very first and foremost, values should be at the forefront of discussions. Secondly, the values should always reflect the working class interest for all. Third, the democracy should be valued and centered in all of the talks. And fourth, eroding democracy shouldn't only be done at the state level. It should also be done through protests and the like. So that was the book. It was a very, very dense book. I think it like grazed the tip of the iceberg on socialist theory. It's very, very dense, but it was good. I don't know. I said this at the beginning. I don't know if I would be like, you need to read this book. As opposed to like this book, Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, this is a book that I'm like, you need to read this. This is such a good book. How to Be an Anti-Capitalist 21st Century. It's a good book. I don't know if you need to read it. It's great if you're really, really interested in it, but it is dense as hell and it will be a struggle. But that concludes this week's Leftist Book Club. Thanks for tuning in if you did. Thanks everybody for watching. If you're watching the video, make sure to like and subscribe. The next book will be The Pinned Comment. I have not decided it yet if you're watching it live, but the next book will be The Pinned Comment. And I will announce that on my Twitter at HoshDrySmith, on my Instagram at HoshDrySmith. I changed it, so it's all the same. And thank you for watching.